Okay, this is my second story I want to tell. It's the little fairy that didn't have a mommy. Now this is my daughter's favorite, one of her very favorite stories. And it was a story told to me when I was a little girl. So it's been around a long time. Okay. Once upon a time, there was a little fairy who didn't have a mommy. And poor little fairy, she was so tired and hungry, and she just had looked and looked for her mommy and just couldn't find her. So she decided that she would fly down and try and find another mommy. She was hungry and tired. So little fairy flew down and she looked and she looked, and all of a sudden she saw Mrs. Grasshopper, and she thought, oh, Mrs. Grasshopper, she'll be a wonderful mother. So she flew down to Mrs. Grasshopper and she said, Mrs. Grasshopper, will you be my mommy? And Mrs. Grasshopper said, oh, little fairy, I couldn't be your mommy. Why, I go to parties every night. Oh, who would take care of you? I'm sorry, little fairy, I just wouldn't be a good mom for you. Okay, said little fairy. So then she thought, well, I'll just keep looking. So she flew around and she looked, and down in the stream she saw a goldfish. Mrs. Goldfish, she's so beautiful. I'll go ask her. So little fairy flew down to Mrs. Goldfish and she said, Mrs. Goldfish, will you please be my mommy? And Mrs. Goldfish said, little fairy, look at this beautiful dress. You'd get your dirty little hands all over it, and then it would be dirty. I couldn't do that. I'm sorry, little fairy. I just can't be your mommy. Poor little fairy. She felt so bad. She thought, well, I'll just keep looking. So she flew and she flew, and she saw a little snail in the water, and she thought, oh, that would be a good mommy. So she went down to Mrs. Snail. She said, Mrs. Snail, I don't have a mommy. I'm so hungry. Will you be my mommy? Now, little fairy, come in. Look in my house. Do you see how beautiful it is? Look at the walls. How gorgeous they are. Pearl walls. Now, look at your hands. You would dirty my house. I'm sorry, little fairy. I just couldn't do that. Oh, poor little fairy. She just felt so bad. But she just wanted to cry. And she thought, well, she heard a sound, a beautiful sound. It was Mrs. Bluebird. And she was singing to her babies. Oh, she thought, Mrs. Bluebird, she's already a mom. She'll be my mom. So she flew up to Mrs. Bluebird and she said, Mrs. Bluebird, will you please be my mommy? And Mrs. Bluebird looked at her and little fairy and she said, little fairy, I have 9 little baby birdies that I'm taking care of. It takes me all day to get their food and to feed them. I just don't have time to take care of you too. I'm sorry, little fairy. Oh, poor little fairy. That was just all she could handle. And she started crying. And she flew and she flew and she found a big rock out in the middle of a pasture. And she flew down to the rock and she laid down. and she just cried herself to sleep. Well, out in the forest was a mother fairy who had been searching and searching for her baby who had gotten lost. And she was just wouldn't give up. And she kept looking and looking, and she came to a meadow, and she saw a rock. And on the rock there was something. She thought, what is that? And she went a little closer, and it was her baby. And she flew down to her baby fairy, and she picked her up in her arms, and she was so happy a tear fell from her eyes onto little baby fairy's cheek. And when that happened, little baby fairy looked up, and she said, "Oh, Mommy, I finally have a mommy." And that's it.